My least favorite Martian is my brother-in-law. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Family awkwardness has a way of sneaking up on you. One moment you're sipping coffee, scrolling through emails, and the next you're staring at your sister's fiancé hovering 3 inches off the carpet, humming faintly like a refrigerator on its last legs. Glarn didn't walk into the room. He phased. 1 second the doorway was empty, the next it was filled with a tall, shimmering figure whose skin looked like polished red stone and whose smile revealed teeth that glinted like quartz. His handshake wasn't a handshake at all, but a static shock that left my palm tingling, as though I'd just touched a live wire. "My designation is Glarn," he said, Dark's eyes glowing. "Though the G is silent, the RN is a frequency only canines perceive, and the rest is unpronounceable without a secondary tongue." I nodded politely, pretending I understood, while my sister beamed as if she'd just introduced us to the inventor of chocolate. He sipped soda through a metallic straw attached directly to his face. When I asked what he did for work, he replied, "I stabilize wormholes." He said it casually, like someone might say, "I'm in accounting." I wanted to laugh, but his posture suggested he was dead serious. My sister squeezed his hand, clearly smitten, while I sat there wondering how long it would take before my Martian brother-in-law phased through my living room wall uninvited. The sulfur scent hit me next, faint but unmistakable, like a match just struck. My sister didn't seem to notice. She leaned closer to him, her eyes radiant with affection, while I leaned back, calculating escape routes. He studied me with glowing eyes as if scanning my molecules. "You are terrestrial," he said, not as an insult but as a fact. "Born and raised," I muttered. He nodded, satisfied, then hovered toward the couch. He didn't sit. He floated just above the cushions, humming faintly. My sister joined him, luminous, while I remained standing, clutching my coffee like a shield. The conversation was surreal. He asked about my job, my hobbies, my role in the planetary ecosystem. I answered cautiously, aware that every word might be translated into Martian frequencies. He spoke of his home world, red skies, thin air, cities built inside craters. He described Martian cinema, where black holes were used for dramatic tension. He explained Martian cuisine, glowing cubes that pulsed like heartbeats. My sister listened, enchanted. I listened, horrified. At one point, he leaned closer and said, "Your planet is fragile, but beautiful." I blinked, surprised. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd given Earth. "Thanks," I muttered. "We try." He smiled, eyes glowing faintly. "You endure." It wasn't much, but it was enough to unsettle me. By the end of the evening, I was exhausted. Not from conversation, but from trying to act normal while surrounded by beings who considered wormholes a career path. My sister looked happier than I'd ever seen her, glowing with love and optimism. Glarn looked smug, as if he'd already won some cosmic game I didn't understand. And me? I sat at the corner table, nursing a flat soda, realizing that my least favorite Martian wasn't just a guest anymore. He was family. Chapter 2. The Wedding. I've been to plenty of weddings in my life. Church ceremonies with stiff pews, beach vows where the wind stole half the words, even one disastrous Vegas elopement. But nothing prepared me for my sister marrying a Martian. The venue itself was ordinary enough, a rented hall with folding chairs, white ribbons, and a buffet table sagging under the weight of potato salad. But the moment Glarn floated in, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't walk down the aisle. He hovered, 3 inches above the carpet, humming faintly like a malfunctioning microwave. His suit wasn't fabric at all, but a shimmering exoshell that pulsed as if it had its own heartbeat. Every pulse sent a ripple of light across the room, and I swear the chandeliers flickered in response. The priest began the vows in English, his voice steady, though I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he held the book. My sister repeated them with radiant confidence, her eyes locked on Glarn as if he were the only being in the universe. Then it was Glarn's turn. He clicked, hummed, and emitted ultraviolet flashes invisible to us, but apparently dazzling to his relatives, who erupted in applause. I clapped too, mostly out of fear that not clapping might be considered an interplanetary insult. Every time the priest mentioned eternal commitment, Glarn's relatives twitched like they were tuning into a distant frequency. I couldn't tell if it was excitement or dread. My sister squeezed his hand, clearly enchanted, while I sat there wondering if she noticed the faint sulfur scent that wafted off him whenever he smiled. The reception was even stranger. The Martian guests floated around the dance floor, emitting sounds that triggered the lights to dim and brighten in rhythm. Glarn's father was literally a sentient dust cloud, drifting politely between tables, leaving guests coughing politely into their napkins. His mother communicated entirely through telepathic sighs, each one leaving me with a vague sense of guilt, as though I'd forgotten to pay my taxes. Dinner was a cross-cultural disaster. Humans ate lasagna and chicken, while Martians absorbed glowing cubes that pulsed like heartbeats. One cube rolled off a plate and onto the floor, where it tried to escape until Glarn casually scooped it up and swallowed it whole. His eyes glowed neon green for a moment, and my sister giggled like it was the cutest thing she'd ever seen. Then came the toast. Glarn raised a glass filled with liquid that shimmered like molten metal and declared, "May our union stabilize the wormholes between us." The Martian guests cheered. The human guests laughed nervously. I didn't laugh at all. I was too busy calculating how long it would take before those wormholes opened in my backyard. The first dance was equally unsettling. My sister moved gracefully, but Glarn's hovering made it look less like dancing and more like a physics experiment. Every time he spun her, she seemed to lose gravity for a second, her feet lifting off the floor before settling back down. The crowd gasped, then applauded, convinced it was some kind of trick. I knew better. Chapter 3. Domestic Invasion. When my sister announced that she and Glarn had bought the house next door, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I thought she was joking. Surely interplanetary marriages came with zoning restrictions. Surely the government had a form you had to fill out before you let a Martian terraform your cul-de-sac. But no. Within a week they were unloading boxes. Or rather, Glarn was phasing them directly from orbit into the living room. One moment the space was empty, the next it was stacked with crates that hummed faintly, as if they contained small suns. My sister carried in the human stuff, books, clothes, a blender. Glarn carried in the Martian stuff, glowing orbs, jars of red dust, and a device that looked suspiciously like a weapon, but was apparently a domestic stabilizer. The backyard was the first casualty. Glarn insisted on terraforming it to remind him of home. Out went the grass. In came a layer of crimson soil that smelled faintly of what hell probably smells like. He erected a dome that shimmered in the sunlight, casting strange shadows across my kitchen window. He said it was for atmospheric balance. I said it looked like a science experiment gone wrong. Inside, things weren't much better. Glarn didn't believe in doors. He phased through walls, appearing in my living room unannounced. Sometimes he'd hover in the corner while I watched TV, critiquing the special effects. "Your human cinema," he'd say, "is quaint. On Mars, we use actual black holes for dramatic tension." My Wi-Fi became collateral damage. Every time Glarn phased in or out, my internet froze. Zoom calls ended mid-sentence, emails vanished, and once my entire playlist was replaced with Martian chanting. My boss asked why I kept dropping out of meetings. I considered telling him the truth, but I doubted my brother-in-law destabilizes wormholes in my living room would count as a valid excuse. Meals were another ordeal. My sister invited me over for dinner, hoping to bond. Glarn absorbed my lasagna into his chest cavity, humming contentedly. He offered me a glowing cube that pulsed. I declined. He shrugged, swallowed it whole, and his eyes glowed neon green. My sister giggled, charmed. I gagged, horrified. The worst part wasn't the sulfur smell, the hovering, or the glowing eyes. It was the casual way Glarn acted like this was normal. He'd sit at the table and ask me about my day as if nothing was strange about the fact that his father was a dust cloud and his mother communicated through telepathic sighs. I tried to complain to my sister, but she brushed it off. "He's just different," she said, smiling. "You'll get used to it." But I didn't get used to it. Every day brought a new invasion. A gadget that replicated spoons until the kitchen overflowed, a toaster that predicted the future. Your bread will burn in 3 minutes, a vacuum cleaner that sucked memories instead of dust. I accidentally lost my recollection of high school prom. Honestly, not a huge loss, but still. By the end of the first week, I realized something terrifying. Glarn wasn't just living next door. He was living in my life, hovering in my living room, phasing through my walls, destabilizing my Wi-Fi, and absorbing my lasagna. And the worst part? He wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 4. Dinner and Other Disasters. Dinner with Glarn was never just dinner. It was an ordeal, a test of endurance, and occasionally a brush with interplanetary food poisoning. My sister insisted that breaking bread together would help me bond with her new husband. Unfortunately, Glarn didn't break bread. He absorbed it. The first time I invited them over, I made lasagna. A safe choice, I thought. Comfort food. Something hearty enough to bridge cultural gaps. Glarn sat at the table, eyes glowing faintly, and when I served him a slice, he didn't pick up a fork. He pressed the plate against his chest cavity, and the lasagna vanished in a shimmer of light. He hummed contentedly, like a refrigerator settling into its cycle. "Delicious," he said, though I wasn't sure if he was complimenting me or the way his body metabolized carbohydrates. My sister beamed, proud of him for trying human food. I stared at the empty plate, wondering if I'd just witnessed digestion or theft. Then Glarn offered me one of his own delicacies, a glowing cube. It sat on the plate, throbbing faintly, as if daring me to touch it. "It is called Zur," he explained, rich in cosmic flavor. I declined. He shrugged, popped it into his mouth, and swallowed it whole. His eyes glowed neon green for several seconds, and he emitted a satisfied sigh that rattled the silverware. My sister giggled, charmed. I gagged, horrified. Subsequent dinners only escalated. One night he brought plasma stew, a dish that looked like liquid lightning. He ladled it into bowls, and the moment I took a sip, my tongue felt like it was conducting electricity. I coughed, sputtered, and reached for water. Glarn chuckled, or at least emitted a sound that resembled laughter, but also triggered the smoke alarm. Another evening, he insisted on grilling meteorite chunks. He claimed they were dense with cosmic minerals. My uncle, who had joined us, broke a tooth trying to chew one. Glarn laughed again, while my uncle excused himself to find a dentist. The worst part wasn't the food itself, it was the way Glarn treated these disasters as bonding experiences. He'd hover at the table, glowing faintly, and ask me about my day as if nothing was strange about the fact that his dinner pulsed like a living organ. My sister encouraged me to be open-minded, but my mind was already stretched to its breaking point. Even the drinks were hazardous. Glarn poured me a glass of Martian refreshment, a liquid that shimmered like molten metal. I took one cautious sip and immediately felt my teeth vibrate. He assured me it was perfectly safe. I assured him I preferred tap water. By the end of each meal, I was exhausted, not from eating, but from surviving. My stomach churned, my nerves frayed, and my patience wore thin. Glarn, meanwhile, looked smug, as if he'd proven some cosmic point about Martian superiority. I realized then that dinner wasn't just dinner. It was a battlefield. My lasagna versus his glowing cubes. My tap water versus his molten drinks. My sanity versus his smug grin. And every time, I lost. Chapter 5. Holidays, Pets, and Neighbors. If you've never celebrated a Martian holiday, let me save you the trouble. Don't. The first one I experienced was called the Flame of Ancestral Memory. My sister explained it was a sacred tradition, a way of honoring Glarn's lineage. What she didn't mention was that it involved setting half the living room on fire. Glarn lit a torch that burned with blue-white flames, then waved it around while chanting in clicks and hums. My sister clapped along, delighted. I ducked behind the couch, convinced the curtains were seconds away from combustion. "Relax," Glarn said. "The fire remembers." I didn't know what that meant, but I knew my eyebrows were in danger. The next holiday was worse. It involved ritual combustion, which is exactly what it sounds like. Glarn ignited a series of glowing cubes that exploded into showers of sparks. My sister called it beautiful. I called it arson. The smoke lingered for days, seeping into my clothes, my furniture, even my dreams. As if the holidays weren't enough, Glarn decided we needed a pet. He brought home something between a lizard and a cloud. It hissed whenever I walked by, its body shifting between scales and vapor. "It is bonding with you," Glarn explained. I disagreed. I was fairly certain it was plotting my demise. The creature followed me everywhere, hovering at ankle level, emitting a faint static hum. One night I woke up to find it perched on my chest, staring at me with glowing eyes. I screamed. It hissed. Glarn appeared instantly, phasing through the wall, and calmly informed me that the pet was expressing affection. I expressed my affection by locking my bedroom door. Neighbors weren't spared either. Glarn's laughter, if you can call it that, triggered car alarms up and down the street. His barbecues involved grilling meteorite chunks that shattered teeth. His hovering startled the mailman so badly he dropped an entire stack of letters in the gutter. My sister brushed it all off. "He's just different," she said, smiling. "You'll get used to it." But I didn't get used to it. Every day brought a new disaster. One afternoon, Glarn's pet slithered into the neighbor's yard and dissolved their garden gnome. Another time, his holiday sparks set off the smoke detectors in 3 houses. People started giving me looks, accusing, suspicious looks, as if I were responsible for the chaos. I tried to explain. "It's my brother-in-law," I said. "He's Martian." They nodded politely, then backed away slowly, as though Martian brother-in-laws were contagious. The worst part was the way Glarn treated all of this as normal. He hovered at the dinner table, glowing faintly, and asked me about my day as if nothing was strange about the fact that his pet hissed at me or his holidays nearly burned down the block. My sister encouraged me to be open-minded, but my mind was already stretched to its breaking point. By the end of the month, I realized something terrifying. Glarn wasn't just disrupting my life, he was reshaping it. Holidays filled with fire, pets filled with malice, neighbors filled with suspicion. And me? I was filled with dread. Chapter 6. Technology and Politics. If Glarn had one weakness, it wasn't humility, it was gadgets. His obsession with Martian technology filled every corner of the house, and eventually mine. It started innocently enough. He brought over a spoon, not just any spoon, but a self-replicating utensil. He set it on the counter, tapped it twice, and suddenly there were 2 spoons. Then 4. Then 8. Within minutes, the kitchen was overflowing with spoons, clattering to the floor like metallic rain. My sister laughed, delighted. I grabbed a broom. Glarn shrugged and said, "Efficiency." Next came the toaster. It didn't just brown bread, it predicted the future. I slid in a slice, pressed the lever, and the toaster announced, "Your bread will burn in 3 minutes." I yanked it out immediately, triumphant. Glarn frowned. "You have disrupted the timeline," he said gravely. as if I'd just caused a paradox. The vacuum cleaner was worse. It didn't suck up dust, it sucked up memories. I was tidying the living room when suddenly I couldn't remember my high school prom. One moment I was pushing the vacuum, the next I was staring blankly, wondering why my yearbook had a gap where a dance should have been. Glarn assured me it was perfectly safe. I assured him I preferred dust. Every gadget came with a smug explanation. On Mars, he'd say, we do not waste time with primitive tools. Meanwhile, I was drowning in spoons, terrified of my toaster and avoiding the vacuum like it was radioactive. But gadgets were only half the problem. The other half was politics. Glarn loved to rant about Martian governance. According to him, their Senate was composed of rotating pyramids. Each pyramid represented a faction, and the faster it spun, the more influence it had. I tried to picture it. Geometry class gone rogue, triangles whirling in endless debate. Your Earth democracy, Glarn said, is quaint. Votes, ballots, campaigns, it is also inefficient. I bristled. At least our leaders don't spin in circles. He smiled, smug, not visibly. He explained that Martian elections were decided by gravitational resonance. Candidates stood in orbit around a planet, and whichever one maintained balance longest won. I asked what happened to the losers. He shrugged. They drift. My sister found his stories fascinating. She leaned in, eyes wide, absorbing every detail. I leaned back, skeptical, wondering if Martian politics were just an elaborate excuse for chaos. The worst part was how Glarn compared everything to Mars. Traffic jams? Primitive. Taxes? Quaint. Jury duty? Laughable. He dismissed Earth systems with a wave of his hand, as if centuries of human struggle were nothing more than a comedy routine. I tried to argue. Our democracy may be messy, but it works. He hovered closer, eyes glowing faintly. Does it? I didn't have an answer, not one that would satisfy him anyway. By the end of the evening, I was exhausted. My kitchen was buried in spoons, my toaster was predicting doom, my vacuum had stolen my memories, and my brother-in-law was lecturing me about spinning pyramids. I realized then that Glarn wasn't just invading my home. He was invading my world view. His gadgets rewrote the rules of daily life. His politics rewrote the rules of society. And me? I was stuck between lasagna and wormholes, trying to hold on to something familiar while everything around me spun out of control. Chapter 7. Sports, Humor, and Arguments. Glarn believed strongly in cultural exchange. Unfortunately, his idea of exchange meant dragging me into Martian sports that had no business being played on Earth. The first was gravball. He explained the rules in 3 words. Survive the match. That was it. No referees, no scoreboards, no halftime. Just survival. The game involved a floating sphere that emitted gravitational pulses strong enough to hurl me into trees, fences, and once, my neighbor's shed. Glarn hovered effortlessly while I stumbled around like a rag doll in a hurricane. You must learn balance, he said, catching the sphere mid-pulse. I must learn first aid, I muttered, brushing dirt off my shirt. I lasted 3 minutes before collapsing, dizzy and bruised. Glarn declared it a promising start. I declared it a lawsuit waiting to happen. Sports weren't the only cultural gap. Glarn's sense of humor was equally incomprehensible. He'd begin with setups like, 2 quasars walk into a singularity, then laugh hysterically before delivering a punchline that never arrived. His laughter wasn't human. It was a sound that rattled windows and triggered car alarms. My sister giggled along, delighted. I smiled weakly, praying for the joke to end. One evening, he told me a classic Martian joke. It involved gravitational collapse, quantum tunneling, and something about a senator spinning too fast. I didn't get it. He laughed. I laughed too, but only because I was afraid not to. The arguments came next. They were inevitable. Glarn had opinions about everything: Earth politics, Earth food, Earth entertainment. He dismissed our democracy as quaint, our cuisine as primitive, and our movies as childish. "Your planet is doomed," he said one night, hovering in my living room uninvited. "Not if you stop destabilizing my Wi-Fi," I shot back. He smiled, smug. "You are jealous." "Of what?" I asked. "Your glowing cubes? Your pet cloud? Your ability to ruin lasagna?" He hovered closer, eyes glowing faintly. "Of my superiority." I bristled. "You're not superior. You're my least favorite Martian." He grinned. "That makes me your favorite too." The worst part was that he believed it. He genuinely thought being my least favorite Martian was a compliment, as if the category itself was prestigious. My sister laughed, charmed by his wit. I groaned, convinced he was gaslighting me with cosmic smugness. Our arguments became routine. He'd phase into my living room, critique my TV shows, mock my politics, and laugh at my jokes for being two-dimensional. I'd counter with sarcasm, frustration, and the occasional plea for him to leave me alone. He never did. By the end of each argument, I was exhausted. Glarn, meanwhile, looked energized, eyes glowing as if conflict fueled him. My sister insisted we were bonding. I insisted we were fighting. But deep down, I knew the truth. Glarn wasn't just my brother-in-law. He was my rival, my nemesis, my least favorite Martian, and somehow, that made him family. Chapter 8. Resolution. By the time the dust settled, literally since Glarn's father was still drifting around the neighborhood, I had reached a breaking point. Weeks of hovering, glowing cubes, sulfur-scented holidays, and memory-stealing vacuums had worn me down. My patience was stretched thinner than the atmosphere on Mars. I sat in my living room one evening, staring at the flickering TV. Glarn phased in without knocking, as usual, and hovered beside me. His eyes glowed faintly, and he looked smug, as if he'd just destabilized another wormhole. "You are unhappy," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. I sighed. "You think?" He tilted his head. "Your resistance is admirable, but unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" I snapped. "You've ruined my Wi-Fi, burned down half the living room, and your pet tried to suffocate me in my sleep." But he didn't argue. Instead, he hovered silently, watching the TV with me. For once, he didn't critique the special effects or mock the plot. He just sat there, glowing faintly, humming softly, as if trying to blend into the background. And in that moment, something shifted. I realized that beneath the smug grin, the sulfur smell, and the chaos, Glarn was trying. His holidays, his gadgets, his sports, they weren't meant to torment me. They were his way of sharing himself, of bridging the gap between Mars and Earth. He wasn't invading my life out of malice. He was doing it out of love for my sister, and by extension, for me. It didn't make the glowing cubes any less disgusting, or the pet any less terrifying. But it did make them tolerable. Family, I realized, isn't about comfort. It's about endurance. It's about tolerating the people who drive you crazy, who hover in your living room uninvited, who destabilize your Wi-Fi and eat your lasagna through their chest cavity. It's about accepting that sometimes your sister's happiness means living next door to a Martian who thinks spoons should replicate endlessly. I turned to Glarn. "You're still my least favorite Martian." He smiled. "And yet, you are my favorite human." I laughed, despite myself. It wasn't a joke, not really, but it was the closest we'd ever come to understanding each other. The TV flickered, the pet hissed from the corner, and the sulfur scent lingered in the air. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even comfortable, but it was family. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Epilogue. The longest orbit life with Glarn didn't end. It settled into orbit. Not the kind of orbit you read about in textbooks, neat and predictable, but the kind where gravity pulls you in strange directions, and you're never quite sure if you're circling stability or chaos. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself adjusting, not happily, but inevitably. The sulfur smell became background noise, like the faint hum of a refrigerator. The glowing cubes stopped startling me, though I still refused to eat them. Even his pet, that lizard cloud hybrid, became less terrifying once I realized it only hissed when I was anxious, which, admittedly, was most of the time. Glarn didn't change. He still phased through walls without knocking, destabilized my Wi-Fi, and critiqued my TV shows with smug references to Martian cinema. But I changed. I stopped expecting him to act human. I stopped waiting for him to understand sarcasm or punchlines. Instead, I accepted that his laughter would always rattle windows, his holidays would always involve combustion, and his gadgets would always threaten my sanity. And strangely, that acceptance brought peace. One evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. Glarn hovered beside me, silent for once. My sister joined us, her hand resting on his, her smile radiant. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like part of something bigger, messier, stranger, but undeniably family. "Your planet," Glarn said softly, "is fragile, but beautiful." I blinked, surprised. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given Earth. "Thanks," I muttered. "We try." He nodded, eyes glowing faintly. "You endure." It wasn't much, but it was enough. I realized then that Glarn wasn't my enemy. He wasn't even my rival. He was my brother-in-law, bound to me not by choice but by circumstance, by love for my sister, and by the strange gravity of family. He was my least favorite Martian, yes, but he was also my only Martian. And maybe that mattered more than I wanted to admit. The world didn't change. The gadgets still cluttered the kitchen, the pet still hissed, the holidays still smoked up the living room. But I changed. I learned to laugh, not at Glarn's jokes, which remained incomprehensible, but at the absurdity of it all. At the way life had thrown me into orbit around a Martian, and how, against all odds, I hadn't spun away. Family, I realized, isn't about comfort. It's about endurance. It's about surviving gravball matches, tolerating glowing cubes, and accepting that sometimes your sister's happiness means living next door to a smug alien who destabilizes wormholes in your living room. And so, as the sunset faded and the stars emerged, I sat beside Glarn, my least favorite Martian, and felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the chaos, not for the sulfur, but for the reminder that family, no matter how strange, no matter how alien, is worth enduring. Because in the end, we're all just trying to stabilize the wormholes between us. The end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.